Hello everyone, and welcome back to another card game tutorial video. In this video I will go over intermediate card special effects that you can add to your card game. In the next video I'll go over more difficult effects. So if you're interested in this series, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you'd like to download these files and support this series, be sure to check out my Patreon, linked in the description below. In this video we will go over Alakazam and Venusaur's Pokemon powers. This is more difficult than the last because we will need to create visuals to inform the opponent what is going on so that they can keep up with the player's moves. For instance, Venusaur allows the player to move energy cards from one card on the field to another. So if I select this energy card here, we can see that I'm now holding an energy card in my hand, and when I decide to place it onto Squirtle, you'll see on the opponent that it will go from Blastoise to Squirtle, like this. And then Alakazam's Pokemon power allows the player to move any damage counters from one Pokemon to another Pokemon without knocking that Pokemon out. And that will look like this. As you can see, we have the Alakazam visual, and we can see that Blastoise now has 3 damage counters instead of 4. And then I'm carrying around this 1 damage counter that I can set wherever I want. I can set it back on Blastoise, or I can set it on top of Squirtle. As you can see, I set it on Squirtle, and it now appears on the other card, and vice versa. And if I try to move energy from Blastoise back to Blastoise, it looks like that. You can barely see it move from Blastoise. It appears just above him. The first thing we need to do is work on a small bug fix. In the last video, we had 2 conditions to maintain the Pokemon power variables. We initialized the variables in the step event, which made them constantly calculated, and that was in the step event of the player object. And what we did was we constantly calculated the variables for the Pokemon powers. So since we initialized these in the step event, they are constantly initialized to 0, and then depending on if the Pokemon on the field has a Pokemon power and is not under any of these conditions, we would assert that variable. And then otherwise, we would deassert it. Now, my idea behind this was if we asserted it to 1, and then after that it was confused or asleep or whatever, we would then need to deassert it. But since we constantly initialize them to 0 the whole entire time, we actually will never need to decrement them. So we're just going to remove that, and that will solve the problem. Now let us jump into Alakazam's Pokemon power. The first thing we will need to do is initialize a new variable in our field card object. And that will be in the create event. And we will call this variable damage select. And we're going to set this equal to false. Next, we need a condition to set damage select to be true. What Alakazam's Pokemon power is that he allows the player to move damage counters amongst the Pokemon on the field as long as it does not result in fainting a Pokemon. So what we want to do is assert this variable when we select the field card we want to move damage from. And we will do that by pressing down on that Pokemon. So we will do it in the left down event. And what condition we want to add here is if the Pokemon power is asserted, which is P Blastoise, that will eventually change to P Alakazam, and we have pressed down on this card, we want to set damage select equal to true. And that is the only condition we want to have here, because the Pokemon power for Alakazam affects all cards on the field. So we won't need to add any other condition here, since any card on the field can use this Pokemon power. So what we're aiming to do is allow the player to select a damage counter from a field card. To make this easier for the player, we need to print the field card object, its damage counters, and its tokens above everything else. To do this, we need to reorient our draw event. So what we need to do is we need to take this line, draw self, the condition to draw the damage counters, and the condition to draw all of the tokens on the card. What we're going to do is we're going to select all of that, we're going to copy it, delete it, and then paste it all the way at the bottom, just so it's the last thing that gets printed. So the last state our game was in, we had it to where the field card was drawn at the bottom of everything, underneath this preview right here. But now that we want to be able to select these damage counters, we want to make sure that we can see it above the preview, because if we didn't, then we wouldn't be able to select these cards, and then we wouldn't be able to select any of the cards on the Pokemon on the bench if this was too large, because we wouldn't be able to see the damage counters if the preview was too large. It would then cover the card on the field. Now, in order to be able to move these damage counters, we want to go to the field card object step event, and then we want to go into the check button released condition here, all the way at the bottom, right above the selected equals false line, and then we're going to add the following conditions. So if the card is selected and the damage select value is true, we want to look to see if the mouse is above any of the damage counters on that field card. So what we're going to do is we're going to create two variables that we're going to call J and Z, and these variables will allow us to, and these variables will store where those damage counters are being printed. So if we go to the draw event, where we draw these damage counters, we have these values where we want the damage counter to be printed relative to the field card object. So we're just going to take these values, we're going to take x minus card width divided by 2 plus 2, and we are going to paste that for J, and then we are going to take this value here for the y coordinate and paste it into Z. Now there's one more variable we want to initialize, and that variable is going to be called damage position. This will be the position of the damage counter we have selected. And then we want to use a for loop to see which damage counter we are hovering over. So we're going to do for I is equal to 0 and I is less than d counters I++. Now within this for loop is going to be the logic to determine where our mouse button is. So within this for loop, we're going to have the condition if I is greater than 10 or less than 10, if the mouse x coordinate is greater than j minus 4, and the mouse x variable is less than j plus 4, we know that we are within the sprite x coordinate of that damage counter, but we also want to check the y coordinate. So if mouse y is greater than z minus 4 and mouse y is less than z plus 4, then we are truly over that damage counter, and we will set the damage position variable to equal I. And then if I is greater than 10, we're going to do the same thing, except we know that the damage counters that are greater than 10 will be printed just above the ones that are less than 10. So we're going to change this value from 4 to 9. Now, outside of the for loop, we want to send a notification to the opponent that we used Alakazam's Pokemon power. We want to reduce the damage counter on the card we selected, update the opponent of the reduced damage, and create a new object to represent that damage counter that you saw me dragging around in the preview. So what we're going to do is, if the damage position variable is greater than -1, which means we have selected a damage counter, we are going to show that we've used the Alakazam card. So I'm just going to put a 1 here because Alakazam's card number is 1. We are going to reduce the amount of damage counters on the field card. We're going to use a new message to update the opponent that we have inflicted damage to ourselves. We are going to send the damage that we have inflicted, which in this case, since we're taking away a damage counter, we're going to send a -1, and then we're going to pass it the position of the card that we've done this to. So we're going to pass position. And then lastly, we're going to create a new variable that will hold the object of the damage token that we will call damage token. And we will create this object. At mouse X and mouse Y on the instances layer. And the object will be called damage token. But now that we have done all of this, we will need to deassert the damage select variable. And we will set that equal to false. So now let us create the message to update our opponent. And that will be script message self damage. So the buffer structure of this will be just like the other ones, except we're going to write two variables to it. The variable at argument 0, which is the damage that we are inflicting onto ourselves, and this one will be a little different because we can pass a negative value or a positive value. We will want to use a buffer S8 so that we can pass a negative value. And then we're going to use buffer U8 to pass the position. And now let's create the macro for this message. So if we go to our client object, in the create event, we have a new macro. And that will have a value of 22. But now that we have this, let's create the case for this message. So if we go to our client handle message script, we'll have a new case all the way at the bottom for message self-damage. And what we're going to do with this case is, with the opponent object, we're going to create two variables, one for the damage that we are inflicting to ourselves, and we're going to read that using the buffer read function. And again, we're going to use buffer S8. That is very important. And then we're going to create another one for the position. And that buffer will be buffer U8. And then with that field card at position, we are going to add that value to the damage counters variable. So if we send a negative value, and if we add that negative value, we'll effectively be subtracting it from our damage counters. If it's a positive, we'll be adding it. So we needed this to be both a positive and negative because we're going to use this same function to send the damage we are taking away from a Pokemon card, and then when we add that damage to a different Pokemon card. Now, the last thing we need to do before we update the server end of this is we need to create that object damage token. So this object will have the sprite of a damage counter. And then all we'll need to do for the create event is we want to create that player variable for the player object. Now, what we want this to do is we want this object to follow the mouse, and we want it to be printed above everything. So we're going to set its depth equal to -3000. We want the player to not be able to do anything while we have this damage counter created on the field, so we're going to set that pause variable to be true. And then we're going to have the X variable of the damage counter to be that of the mouse, X position, and then same with the Y position. Now, what we want to do is whenever we select a card to add this to, we're going to use a left released event. And in order to determine what card we've selected, we're going to create a variable called position, and we're going to set that equal to field position, a script we created earlier in the series. Now, if that position variable is greater than -1, which means we have selected this value, or we have selected a position, if that field position has a card object there, with that field card, if the damage counters +1 is equal to the health points of that card, we want to return, because if this were to knock out a Pokemon, that would not be allowed. So this is the condition we'll use to stop that. If it doesn't knock that Pokemon out, then we are going to recall that self-damage message, and we're going to pass it 1 damage counter at the position we've selected, and then we're going to increment the damage counters of that card. And then after that, we want to destroy this damage counter object, and then we want to unpause the game. So now that we have that, let's update the server end of the game. So we need to create a macro for the new message, which is message self damage. And we're going to set that equal to 22. And then we need to create the case for that message. So all the way at the bottom, and this buffer structure will look like this. We're going to start at the beginning. We're going to write the message ID, the socket ID, and then again we're going to call that buffer S8 for the first variable that was written to the buffer, and then buffer U8 for the second one, and then we're going to send it to the opponent. So now that we have this, we can test it. So now that we have this, if we select on Chansey, we can see that she's being drawn above the preview, and the same with Blastoise. So now to test this, if we select this damage counter right here, we can see that we have sent that preview to the opponent, and then we have this damage counter just floating around that we can now drop onto Blastoise. And we can see that it is updating everything appropriately. And again, we wanted to print this above the preview because if I wanted to move this damage counter off of Blastoise, I needed to be able to see it. So now I can see it perfectly, and then I can just move it around. But one thing that I did mess up was, as you can see, if I try to select this damage counter right here, it doesn't allow me. Now that is an easy fix. All I have to do is, in the for loop for when we choose a damage counter, we need to increment I a specific way. Or no, we need to increment J a specific way. So J is the X coordinate, and at the end of the for loop, we want to increment it by 8 because 8 is the number of pixels of a damage counter. We want to move it along the x-axis, just like we've done here. So if we add this here, that will work perfectly. So we know that this works. So now we can change this from P Blastoise to P Alakazam and move on to the next Pokemon power. And that is going to be Venusaur's. Now, Venusaur's Pokemon power allows the player to move Leaf Energy from one Pokemon to another. For this video, we will do Water-type Energy, since that is what is in my deck. The first thing we will need to do is add another condition in our Field Card Object step event within the Mouse Released button here. And this will be just under the Remove Energy condition here. So what we want is if the player releases the mouse button and the temp variable, and this is the variable that represents the card selected in the pile, which was done in an earlier video, which is here, this temp variable, if that variable is greater than -1, we want to move that card to another card on the field. In order to do that, we will do the following. If the player value for P Blastoise is greater than 0, and the temp variable is greater than -1, and the pile value at the temp position is equal to 102, we want to do this action. Now, whenever we test this, we want to change this value to P Venusaur, and we want the card number to be 99 instead of 102. So the first thing we need to do is remove the card from the pile. And what we're going to do in order to do that is we're going to create some variables. one being the card number, which we're going to call number, and we're going to set that equal to pile at the temp value. The next one is going to be the location of the card that we are taking it from, which is the position of the field card. And then we want the card position, which we are going to refer to as card. And we are going to set that equal to temp. So now what we're going to do is we're going to remove this card from the pile. And we're going to do that with a for loop. We're going to set I equal to temp. And I is less than pile count minus 1, I plus plus. And what we're going to do is set pile at I equal to the next value in the pile. And then after that, we are going to set the last pile, or we're going to set the last value in the pile equal to 0. And at the same time, we're going to decrement the number of cards in the pile. And then after that, we want to reset our tokens array. So for I is equal to 0 and I is less than token count, I plus plus, we're going to set tokens at the position of I equal to 0. Now after that, we want to create a new object called energy move. And this will represent the energy card we've removed from the pile. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new instance using the instance create layer function at mouse X, mouse Y on the instances layer. And we're going to use object energy move. And then with that object, we are going to set the variable within that object. We are going to refer to as location to the location variable we just created. We are going to set the card position equal to the card variable we just created. And then we're going to set the card num of this object equal to the number variable we just created. And then we are going to set the player object equal to object player. And then after that, we want to send the opponent a preview of the card's Pokemon power we just used. So we're going to send it Venusaur's card number, which is 15. So now that we have that, let us create the energy move object. Now, we're going to set the sprite of this object to the card back sprite. And in the create event, we're going to add one variable. And that variable is going to be called skip. We're going to set that equal to false. Now this variable is going to be used to prevent the player from selecting this card, because we're going to use this for the opponent when he moves the energy card from one card to another, and we're going to be using this object when we show some kind of representation to the opponent object. And when we send it to the opponent object, we don't want to allow the opponent object to take that card and do whatever we're about to allow the opponent to do with this. So the next thing we're going to create is the step event. And in the step event, we are going to set the sprite index of this object to be the card number. And then we want this to be printed above everything else. And then if skip is true, we want to return from here. And then we're going to set the pause variable equal to true so that the opponent can't do anything until he does something with this card. And then we want this object to move with the mouse. So the next thing we're going to do is create a left released event. Now, if skip is true, we're going to return because we don't want the opponent to steal this energy card. And then we're going to create a local variable called position, and we're going to set that equal to the field position we are hovering over, so that we know where we're going to set this down. And as long as that position variable is greater than -1, we can do that. So if the field card at that position exists, we are going to play the audio of setting a card down. And then we are going to add that card to the field card at that position. And then we're going to send a message called energy move, which is a new message that is going to create a visual for the opponent. And we are going to pass it location, card, and position. And this is so it knows where to move the card from the first location to its final destination, which would be position. And then the card will be used to determine the card number. And then we are going to destroy this instance. And then we will turn the pause variable off. So now when this object is created for the opponent to see that an energy card is moved from one location to another location, we're going to use a very similar set of code that you've seen somewhere else. All we're going to do is move it from its current position to the position we want it to move to. And then whenever it reaches that destination or position, we will destroy the object. That simple. So now let's create the message to do that. So this buffer structure will follow the following format. We're going to pass it 3 variables, well technically 4, the message, which will be energy move, then a variable with the buffer size of U8, another one with the size of U32, and another one with the size of U8. But now let's create the macro for energy move. And this value will be 23. So now let's go to the client handled message script and create a case for this message. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a few local variables. One called location1. We're going to set that equal to buffer read from the buffer with the size of U8. Next is going to be the card, which we're going to read from the buffer with the size of U32. And then the last one will be location 2. Now with that, with the opponent object, we want to remove the energy card from the first one. So with field card at location 1, I'm going to create a local energy or a local variable for the energy card. We're going to set that equal to pile at card. So now we have the card number of the energy card that's being moved. Now, then we're going to remove this card from the pile, the same way we did it before. And then we're going to set the last card in the pile to 0, at the same time decrementing the pile count. And then we're going to reset the tokens for this card. So now the next thing we want to do is add the energy to the second card. So with the field card at location 2, the pile at pile count plus plus is equal to energy card. So now if you're wondering why we didn't just pass it the card number, we didn't want to, just so we can remove the correct card at the correct position. So we needed that position, which is why we didn't just send the card number. But now that we've removed it from the first and added it to the second, now let's create the visual. So we're going to create a temp variable that says instance create layer, and we're going to set that at the field X coordinate for location 1 and the field Y coordinate for location 1 as well. And then we're going to add this to the instances layer. And then we're going to use the object energy move. Now, the next thing we want to do is create 2 local variables for where we want this card to go. So we're going to create a local variable called X position. And we're going to set that to the field X coordinate of location 2. And then we're going to create a Y position variable equal to field Y coordinate at location 2. Now with that temp object, we are going to set the image angle to be 180 so that it appears to be upside down to the opponent. We're going to set the player object to be the opponent object, or we're going to set the player variable to be the opponent object. Then we're going to set the card number of this object to be that of the energy card variable. Then we're going to set its X position to be that of the X position variable we created, and same with the Y position. We're going to set the skip variable to be true because we don't want the opponent to be able to select this object. And then we're going to set its alarm 0 to equal 5. And that's all we'll need to do for this. But now we need to add this to the server object. So we need to add the macro for energy move. Which will be 23. And then we're going to add this to the server handle message script. And this buffer structure will look like this. Of course, we're sending the message ID and the socket ID, but we are passing through a variable through buffer U8, another through buffer U32, and another through buffer U8. And that's all we will need to do for that. So now let's test this. So now that we have Blastoise and Poliwag on the field, I should be able to move energy from Blastoise to Poliwag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this energy card here. As you can see, I used Venusaur's Pokemon power. Venusaur now only has 2 energies on him. And then now if I select Poliwag, we can see that the card moved from Blastoise, which now still has 2, and went to Poliwag, who now has 1. But now let's move it back from Poliwag to Blastoise. And now let's try to move it from Blastoise to Blastoise. So we know that works. So that's all I wanted to go over in this video. In the next video, I will go over a more difficult one, which will be that of electrodes. So if you're interested in that, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to be able to download these files and support this series, be sure to check out my Patreon linked in the description below. Until next time.